On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, a man in a dark business suit walked up to the Northwest Orient counter at Portland International Airport and paid $20 in cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. No luggage, no checked bags, no return flight booked. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, calm, unremarkable, the kind of face a ticket agent forgets within the hour. He boarded Flight 305, took his seat in the back row, 18C, next to an empty middle seat, lit a cigarette, and ordered a bourbon and soda before the plane had even left the runway. The flight was a short regional hop up the coast to Seattle. 30 minutes in the air, nothing more. Just after takeoff, Cooper passed a folded note to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. She assumed it was a phone number. Men slipped her notes like that constantly. She tucked it into her uniform pocket without opening it and kept working the aisle. Cooper leaned toward her. "Miss," he said quietly, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She opened it at his seat. The words were typed, clean, and completely without emotion, like a business memo. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills, unmarked, used, nothing sequential. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 main and 2 reserve, and he wanted all of it waiting on the tarmac in Seattle the moment the plane touched down. To prove he wasn't bluffing, he opened his briefcase just enough for her to see what looked like red cylinders wired to a battery and a cluster of wires running to a switch resting in his hand. Florence walked to the cockpit and told Captain William Scott. From that second forward, Northwest Orient Flight 305, 36 passengers, 5 crew members, and 1 man who had built himself out of nothing but a typed sentence, became the only hijacking in the entire history of American commercial aviation that has never been solved. The pilot radioed ahead to Seattle. Northwest Orient's president personally authorized the ransom without hesitation. $200,000, worth well over $1 million today, pulled together from local Seattle banks in under 2 hours flat. And in that scramble, FBI agents on the ground had the presence of mind to do one thing that would matter more than anyone in that room could have possibly known. Before the cash left the vault, they microfilmed every single serial number on all 10,000 bills, one by one. While the money was being assembled, Cooper had the plane circling over Puget Sound, burning time, never once raising his voice. He ordered the cabin lights in coach switched off so nobody could see out the windows and track the plane's position. He specified military-issue parachutes, not the decorative kind used for air shows, a detail that told investigators later he clearly knew the difference, that this wasn't his first time near a rig. When a flight attendant offered him a second drink mid-flight, he paid for it and told her to keep the change. Polite to the very last request. At 5:45 that evening, the plane finally landed in Seattle. Cooper let all 36 passengers off, along with 2 of the flight attendants. He kept 4 people on board, the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and 1 remaining attendant, a woman named Tina Mucklow. A Northwest Ground employee walked out across the tarmac and handed a canvas sack of cash and a parachute bag up through the aft stairway door. Cooper checked the money not by counting it bill by bill, but by fanning quickly through the stacks, watching, investigators believed, for a dye pack or a hidden transmitter. Then came his final set of instructions. And this is where the story stops being a robbery and starts being something almost impossible. Fly to Mexico City. Stay below 10,000 feet. Keep the landing gear down, the wing flaps locked at 15 degrees, and the cabin unpressurized the entire way. Any commercial pilot hearing those exact numbers would understand immediately what he was setting up, because that specific configuration is the only way to safely open a rear air stair door on a Boeing 727 while it's still in the air. At 7:36 p.m., somewhere above the black, storm-soaked forest of southwest Washington state, the rear stairway of that 727 lowered open in mid-flight. In the cockpit, sealed off exactly as Cooper had ordered, the crew felt the plane buck slightly. A small mechanical jolt buried inside a thunderstorm. Easy to miss if you didn't know to look for it. When they were finally cleared to check the cabin after landing safely in Reno, Nevada, Dan Cooper was gone. His black tie was still there, clipped neatly to the headrest of his seat, folded, like he'd taken care to leave it behind on purpose. The money was gone with him. 2 of the 4 parachutes, both reserves, sat completely untouched on the seat beside where he'd been sitting.
He had jumped with only a single main chute, alone, at night, directly into a thunderstorm, over freezing mountain forest, wearing nothing but a business suit and a pair of loafers. Nobody has ever definitively found him. Not his body, not his real name, not one single verified trace of the man who called himself Dan Cooper. The FBI opened a case file and gave it a name, NORJAK, short for Northwest Hijacking. 200 agents worked it in the first weeks alone. Search planes and ground teams combed the presumed drop zone for months, dragging creeks, walking grid patterns through dense timber, checking every hunting cabin for 100 miles. Over the following 4 decades, more than 1,000 men were formally named as suspects. A Vietnam veteran and skilled skydiver named Richard McCoy carried out an almost identical hijacking just 5 months later, using nearly the same method. Arrested within days, but never definitively linked to the first crime, and killed in a shootout with police years afterward before investigators could close the loop. An airline mechanic named Kenneth Christensen died wealthy and reclusive in 1994, and on his deathbed told his brother something so strange and specific about the hijacking that his own family spent years afterward convinced he'd been Cooper all along. A con man and ex-convict named Dwayne Weber whispered one name to his wife as he was dying in a hospital bed in 1995. Dan Cooper, and then died without ever explaining why he'd said it. Not one of them was ever charged. Not one of them was ever matched with certainty to the hair samples, the fingerprints, or the tie Cooper left folded on his seat. Then, in February of 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was digging a small fire pit in the sand on a family picnic along the banks of the Columbia River, north of Vancouver, Washington. A few inches beneath the surface, his fingers hit something that wasn't a rock. He pulled up 3 decaying packets of cash, still bound together with rotting rubber bands. The FBI matched the serial numbers to their 9-year-old microfilm within hours. $5,800 of Cooper's original ransom, found nearly a decade later, more than 20 miles from where investigators had spent years believing he had actually landed. That discovery didn't close the case. It cracked it wide open into new, harder questions. If the cash had drifted downriver on its own and simply washed ashore, did that mean Cooper's body, and the rest of the money, was still buried somewhere out in that wilderness, exactly where he'd fallen? Or did the river current not match the search zone at all, meaning the FBI had spent nearly a decade combing entirely the wrong stretch of forest? Geologists who studied the sediment layers where the bills were buried couldn't agree with each other. Some argued the cash had settled there naturally over years of slow deposit. Others argued the soil around it looked disturbed, like something or someone had moved it there long after 1971, not in the moment of the jump itself. For 45 years, the file stayed open, one of the longest unsolved cases in FBI history. Agents rotated onto it and off it as they retired, one generation of investigators handing the same unanswered questions to the next. Amateur researchers who called themselves Cooperites built entire private archives of leads the Bureau had officially abandoned, some spending decades and their own retirement savings chasing a man who may have died in that storm on the very first night. In July of 2016, the FBI quietly announced they were suspending active investigation into NORJAK, redirecting their remaining resources elsewhere. They were careful about the wording. They didn't say the case was solved. They said simply that it was no longer worth continuing to pursue. No parachute was ever recovered. No skeleton was ever recovered. Not one additional serial number from that ransom ever surfaced again. Not in a bank deposit, not in a pawn shop, not in an estate sale, Not once, anywhere in the country, in over 50 years. A man walked onto a commercial airliner with a $20 ticket, threatened 36 strangers with a bomb that was never actually tested or detonated, extracted $200,000 from an airline in under 2 hours, and then jumped out of the back of a Boeing 727 at night into a thunderstorm over one of the most densely forested and heavily searched regions in the entire country, and simply stopped existing. What's left behind isn't a solved mystery. It's a signature. A police composite sketch of a calm man in dark sunglasses, reprinted more times than almost any wanted poster in FBI history. A folklore festival held every November in the small town of Ariel, Washington, nearest the presumed jump site, where people still gather every single year just to argue about what happened to him. And airport security itself changed because of that one flight. Within a year, airlines had peepholes installed in cockpit doors. Within a few more, metal detectors, the ones every air traveler still walks through today, were built directly in response to the wave of hijackings that Cooper's flight helped set off across the country. A man bought a $20 ticket, finished his drink, and disappeared into a mountain storm with a stranger's money strapped against his chest. And more than 50 years later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation still does not know his real name. I will see you in the next one.